Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Wednesday, December 24th, day 810 of the war. Merry Christmas to all who are celebrating. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our legal and settlements reporter, Jeremy Sharon. Jeremy, thank you so much for joining me today.
Good to be with you, Amanda.
Always a pleasure, and it's been a while, so we have a lot to catch up on. And yesterday, the Defense Minister and Finance Minister issued statements pushing for Israel to resettle the Gaza Strip. The Defense Minister later walked back to his statements, but the Finance Minister doubled down and also demanded that during the upcoming U.S. trip of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, that Netanyahu somehow convince U.S. President Donald Trump to also annex the West Bank. So we're going to hear all about this and also these newly recognized and newly legalized settlements throughout the West Bank. We're also going to talk about pushback from a recent IPC famine report in Gaza, and we'll hear what the High Court of Justice had to say about the firing of Attorney General Gali Baharav Miara. All of this and more when we're back.
Over 2,000 years ago, the Hanukkah flame burned against all odds, a symbol of resilience and hope that still shines brightly today. Now, Israel once again turns to light, not just to remember, but to protect and rebuild. As the country rises from 2 years of war, the Technion's brightest minds are leading the way, revitalizing the economy, strengthening national security, and shaping a future full of promise. This Hanukkah, we honor the Technion minds who bring light to the darkness, in our labs, on our front lines, and in our hearts. May the light of innovation illuminate every corner of Israel, heralding a new era of strength and renewal.
And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our settlements and legal reporter, Jeremy Sharon. So earlier on Tuesday morning, Defense Minister Israel Katz told a group of settlement leaders that, quote, with God's help, when the time comes, we will also establish pioneer groups in northern Gaza in place of the settlements that were evacuated. Now, he later in the day walked back this statement, but Jeremy, why are we seeing figures, high-level figures, such as the defense minister and the finance minister, at least floating these ideas right now?
Okay, so yeah, I have a theory about this, and it's kind of a two-pronged theory, really. It starts with the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and I think over the last two years, at least, if not the entire duration of this government, we've seen that Netanyahu doesn't really have a strategy for some of the most key issues facing the country. That includes what to do with Gaza. At any stage of this war, he was asked to formulate some kind of day after plan from very close to the beginning of the war and didn't want to. What to do, how to handle the West Bank, how to handle the Palestinians in general, and the basic conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. And the reason that he doesn't have a strategy on those key issues is because he is very much dependent on the far right and ultranationalist parties of his government. Sometimes there's a zeitgeist towards settling in Gaza, for instance, especially when Trump says things like he's going to encourage Palestinians to emigrate out of the territory. Then Trump changes his policy, and Israel has to change its policy. So we see kind of like a strategy vacuum on these key issues and other issues as well. On the other hand, the other prong of my theory here is that within the Likud party and on the Israeli right in general, there is like a race to be the most populist, the most right wing, and to say the things which will play to the base of the Likud party and the right wing zeitgeist as much as possible. So therefore, even though Trump has said that there is no possibility of Israel annexing or settling in Gaza, and Netanyahu himself also repeated that, we see people like Israel Katz, the Israeli defense minister, come along and say things to an audience of of settlers, settler activists, settler leaders that Israel is going to settle in the northern West Bank. In the northern part of the Gaza Strip. Exactly because of this race to be the most populist right wing, and because of that strategy vacuum which Netanyahu has led. Because at the end of the day, Netanyahu is the prime minister. He leads the country. He determines he should determine strategy, long-term strategy for the country. But in that vacuum, the people around him say the things which might be beneficial to them politically, and that's my explanation for how you can have such senior ministers saying things which are apparently contradictory to what the policy at present, which the Prime Minister is apparently meant to be following.
Especially in the case of, for example, resettling Gaza. My question is always, how popular is this in terms of grassroots activists who are actually going to take up the flag and do that? And we saw last week, of course, that two groups of settler activists from the group Nahala, a settlement organization, that they did storm into the Gaza Strip, of course, on the side that the IDF still controls. And they did plant the flag, literally and metaphorically, in two different locations. But how many people are we talking about? What kind of percentage of the Israeli population actually wants to go back and resettle Gaza in the very practical, physically, actually being on the ground term?
In terms of kind of like polling, that type of thing, I'm not sure. I don't think the numbers are very high for Israel annexing or settling parts of the Gaza Strip. I don't think there's a huge amount of public support for it, even though the idea is not as taboo as it was. And we've discussed that before, that the settler movement and the right wing, or the kind of ultra-nationalist part of the Israeli right wing, has succeeded in making this kind of part of the national debate, whereas a year or two ago, certainly before October 7th, there would have never even been a thought to try and reassert control in Gaza in any way. So I don't think there's massive public support, but and even within the settler movement, I don't think there's a large amount of people who would actually do what those activists did last week and break through the borders of Gaza and establish, a wildcat settlement outposts in Gaza, as some people do in the West Bank. I think the number of those types of people are incredibly small. If you would start to talk about the number of people who would want to settle Gaza if the government approved it, then I think you're talking there's a few more percentage points of people who would do that, but still not very great numbers. But nevertheless, I definitely think that there is a hard core of hardline radical settler activists who would definitely go ahead and set up settlements in the West, in Gaza, and Nahala, that movement, has actually organized 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 cadres of settler activists who, according to the organization, are ready to move into Gaza as soon as they get the go ahead, and that's what we saw last week with two of their groups trying to do just that.
Now let's turn to the West Bank. And on Sunday, we heard that 19 new settlements were officially recognized, legalized. And as I understand it, they are divided between along the Green Line and also very deep inside the West Bank. And in terms of public opinion, there seems to be a lot more support for this kind of settlement than the Gaza Strip, obviously. In terms of numbers, we see that definitely. But this idea that settlements are increasingly being recognized by this government, I think this is the 69th settlements that are being recognized since September even, something like that. Correct me with the numbers. But what do you make of this approach to settling the West Bank?
Well, yeah, that's the number which Bezalel Smotrich has said. He's the finance minister, but he's also a minister in the defense ministry, and he has a large amount of power over civilian affairs. And this is his a key part of his strategy to create more new settlements, to legalize what were formerly illegal outposts. And he's been saying this for months, if not years, that he is working on creating de facto sovereignty, Israeli sovereignty in the West Bank by establishing more settlements, legalizing outposts, expropriating more land in the West Bank for settlement development, infrastructure and commercial development, and breaking up Palestinian territorial contiguity. This is, he has put in a series of measures, enacted a series of measures, which has given himself huge powers over what happens in the West Bank in order to do just this, to kind of make Israel's presence in the West Bank even more irreversible, including in the more far-flung areas which are not within the consensus within Israel that Israel could keep hold of under any kind of future arrangement. And he's not embarrassed or shy about saying that this is his strategy. And by the way, not only is 69 new settlements or outposts being legalized, I think that we're talking about several dozen, if not I think about 120 illegal outposts have been established. Well, if we've had dozens of outposts being legalized during this government and dozens of new outposts being created during this government, well, then in the future, we can think that some of those dozens of outposts legalized in the current government will be legalized in the future, especially during the course of this government, the government has, and Smotrich in particular, and the settlement movement have seized upon the tactic of establishing what are called farming outposts, which, unlike residential settlements, take up or expand the Israeli presence over much greater areas of land in the West Bank. And again, this is an explicit tactic to seize control of as much land in the West Bank as possible, and deny it to the Palestinians. And as Smotrich said again today, right now, these policies are basically his life's work. This is the mission of his life. He said that repeatedly. He said it again today. It is the mission of his life to thwart the establishment of a Palestinian state, and that's what he's achieving, and what he has been achieving during the last 3 years on the ground. And then today, or yesterday, I should say, as he said, he called on Netanyahu to demand from Trump, or to tell Trump that Israel is demanding to turn that de facto sovereignty into de jure sovereignty, to really legally establish Israeli control and Israeli sovereignty over the West Bank and annex it.
Right, and you can see it in the most minute settlements, meaning an outpost could just be a couple with a few children of their own living, and with a herd of their own. And I think the herd is very key here, because through grazing, the animals, they're spreading out their control over the territory. And Jeremy, you've done some work on this, and you've gone out to some of these outposts over the past several years. And this, of course, is a recipe for brushing up with, for example, the Bedouin, who have settled and also classically, traditionally been a herding society. So do you see that this is one of the more prevalent places where there are potentially violent clashes right now in the West Bank?
Yeah, absolutely. What this phenomenon of establishing these small farming outposts has created is that because they exert control over large areas of land, what happens is these settlers, they establish an outpost, and then they buy several dozen head of sheep or cattle or whatever it is and graze them. And they graze them over several hundred or several thousand dunams in the West Bank. And that brings them inevitably into friction with local Palestinian populations, whether it's Bedouin herders or rural populations in the West Bank, which are under Israeli control. It inevitably increases the scope of friction between these two groups, and that is what is leading to violence on I think a daily rate, and that is without doubt one of the drivers in the severe spike we've seen in recent months of settler violence, and something which is obviously only kind of further aggravating the conflict.
We'll go to a short break.
3 million Israelis are dealing with trauma since October 7th. To help Israelis heal, Hadassah is there, with the largest rehabilitation center in Jerusalem, world-renowned medical centers, and youth villages. It's said, saving a life saves the world. Imagine helping millions. This is Hadassah, a life-changing force in Israel and the world.
And we're back. Jeremy, you have been continuously reporting on the IPC Famine Monitoring Organization throughout these past several years of war in the Gaza Strip. And on Friday, they came out with another report, which actually seemed very similar to their previous report. So, to begin with, let's start by explaining what is this IPC Famine Monitoring Organization?
The IPC is an organization which is seen as very authoritative for determining food insecurity around the world, especially in conflict zones. It's a branch or department of the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization, and its reports are taken very seriously around the world by governments, by the UN and other international organizations and institutions. So what it says matters. But in the case of Israel, we've seen in a series of its reports some very problematic methodology and conclusions, which a lot of analysts have questioned very strongly and challenged.
Right. We've discussed this previously when other reports have come out, but the wartime conditions in Gaza have made the procedure, the recorded protocol, rather difficult to carry out. And so, in place of that, there have been some alterations in terms of the protocol. And this, of course, skews the findings. So, this seems to be Israel's biggest criticism. Can you elaborate on this a little bit? And again, I just want to emphasize nobody is saying that the situation in Gaza is good. There's obviously need in Gaza, and we are not at all denigrating that need in any kind of way, but there is a difference between claiming famine and recognizing the need in Gaza. So, Jeremy, please explain a bit more about the criticisms coming from Israel.
Okay, so one of the main criticisms is that the IPC's data appears to use figures which are not weighted and are not aggregated. What do I mean? The IPC takes studies of malnutrition based on what's called the middle upper arm circumference metric, and it takes various studies from various districts of Gaza, and then and what it's done is it has used unweighted data, meaning it doesn't account for discrepancies or differences in the number of very young children monitored versus older children. When monitoring lots of younger children would skew results towards a more severe outcome, and taking too many older children would skew results the other way. So the data presented by the IPC in August, when it said there was a famine in Gaza, and also in the latest report, has used unweighted data, and it also has used it has presented just the studies themselves without aggregating the results. Now, there's another organization called the Nutrition Cluster, which is specifically focused on malnutrition, and it reports from around the world and collects data from around the world. Now, it has presented weighted aggregated data throughout the conflict, and we see that in August, unlike the IPC determination, that there was never a famine according to the malnutrition data. In fact, the level of malnutrition, while very high and severe, and as you said, we shouldn't diminish that or diminish the suffering in Gaza, was 23% under the famine threshold. And since the peak in August, it has also declined rapidly. It was 11.9% in August and is now down to 5.4% for the latest statistics in December. So we've seen a very marked improvement. And yet the IPC did not walk back its claim that there was famine in Gaza. And I remind you, the IPC has three key metrics for determining famine, one of which is a particular threshold for that MUAC metric, or for the malnutrition metric in general, and that was not met, and the data shows that was never met in August. But yet the IPC continued to assert that there was famine in August, despite the data, and so that's obviously an ongoing issue we're having with the IPC reports. There's also until now, it's never presented data on the number of people who have died not as a result of the war. In this, and that's another key, one of the three key determining factors for whether you can determine a famine. But despite never having had or presented that data, it always said it was impossible to get it under wartime conditions. It nevertheless went ahead and determined famine, even though it's one of the key three determining factors. This time, it did provide some data, but not in an organized manner or in a manner which is easy to evaluate. But nevertheless, the data it found, the data it presented on non-trauma deaths, which is anything including malnutrition and disease and other conditions, that was that showed the data on non-trauma deaths was somehow it presented data which was actually under the rate of non-trauma deaths before the war. So it's unclear what the IPC was trying to prove. There was a certain spike in such deaths during July and August, but nevertheless, as I said, it was still under the rate for peacetime. Now it's unclear why that would be, but some people have speculated, and this is just speculation, but it is possible that taking data from the Hamas-run Gaza Ministry of Health during the period of war, that those numbers of the non-trauma deaths were being repurposed as wartime trauma deaths due to Israeli military action as part of the of Hamas's propaganda campaign against Israel to inflate the numbers of people dying. This is just by Israeli military action. This is just speculation, but it would account to a certain extent for this bizarre data presented by the IPC, where non-trauma deaths during the wartime were actually under the rate for peacetime. These are just some of the methodological problems we've seen in the IPC report, and we'll be reporting on that more fully in the next day or two.
Please check out the site for more updates on this, and I will include in the program notes other articles that Jeremy has written on this subject. Now, Jeremy, we've gone on a very long time, but since we haven't spoken for so long, we need to have an update over the Attorney General. And earlier this month, the High Court of Justice ruled unanimously 7-0 to annul the government's decision to fire Attorney General Gali Baharav Miara. This came as little surprise to anyone, including the rulings from the more conservative justices. I think this was very predicted, and equally predictable, I believe, was the government's response to that, which was essentially, as I understand it, just ignore this ruling. So, Jeremy, fill us in a little bit about what's happened since.
Yes, this is really a really massive issue affecting the rule of law in Israel, and which may potentially have consequences for a further increase of the clash between the judiciary and the government, because the government fired Attorney General Gali Baharav Miara in August in a very highly controversial way. They started down one particular path of dismissing the Attorney General. They realized that they couldn't make it work under those terms of that dismissal process, and then changed entirely the dismissal process from a professional committee evaluating the terms of her dismissal to an entirely political committee staffed only by cabinet ministers who inevitably decided that she should be fired. So what the court said was that the government was simply trying to engineer a dismissal committee which would deliver the outcome it sought without trying to have a real honest process for her dismissal, which would actually evaluate the merits of the government's arguments against her and the Attorney General's arguments against the government. And essentially what the court said, that this is just not legitimate. You can't do that in a state which is trying to abide by the rule of law. The court didn't even evaluate the arguments the government had against the Attorney General, because it was looking at this process which the government embarked on, which was simply to, as I said, engineer the dismissal of the Attorney General, because that's what it wanted, regardless of how a functioning state, a functioning democratic state, deals with one of the most senior, or if not the most senior law enforcement officer in the country, the Attorney General, who's head of the prosecution, who basically interprets the law for the government. And to dismiss the Attorney General in such a kind of politicized manner. The court was saying this is not something which really can fly. Now, as you pointed out, 2 of the 7 justices on the panel are the most conservative justices on the court itself, including, for instance, Noam Solberg and David Mintz. They're both, I might point out, religious. They both live in the settlements, and Justice Minister Yeravin is always talking about how he wants more diversity on the court, and that the court reflect the people of Israel more greatly, referring basically to having more right-wing conservatives on the court, and even those 2, they did not submit an opposition, a dissenting opinion to this ruling, which I think shows just how far the government strayed from what is acceptable procedure in the way it handles, as I said, some of the most senior kind of guardians of the rule of law in the country. And Levin and the communications minister Shlomo Kari immediately said we're just going to ignore the court ruling and defy the court, and that would really bring about a severe constitutional crisis. But I think again it shows that the whether you're talking about the way the government deals with or doesn't deal with enforcing the law on Haredi enlistment, whether you're talking about how Levin wants to appoint a special prosecutor for the State Haman investigation and do it on his own terms, all these types of issues and others, that Levin and the government want to do what they want to do without interference from legal guardrails, from the Attorney General, from judicial review, and they're not willing to accept any dissent, even when it comes from really hardline conservatives on the courts. Noam Solberg, I mentioned it before, he's ruled he's ruled in favor of the government several times. He's rebuked in his decisions the Attorney General on several occasions, and yet here he was one of the leading advocates within the panel of several justices to strike down this decision because it just flew in the face of anything acceptable for a government in the way it does administrative law.
Jeremy, thank you so much for all of these updates today. Thank you.
No worries, Amanda. Good to be with you.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, Shalom.